Hello, this is Sam Gerrans from samgerrans.com. Today is Friday, 25th of August, 2023. And today the subject is understanding highly propagandized people. And what I want to do is to get into some of the more general concepts about propaganda and what it's like living in a highly propagandized society. But before that, a little bit of housekeeping. As I mentioned on Wednesday, starting next week, I'm going to be making 2 videos a week rather than 3, probably on Tuesday and Thursday. The reason is I'm just too busy. But now let's cut to this subject. Now, in this part of my project, what I've been trying to do is to explain what propaganda is, how propaganda works, why it's necessary, why it is unavoidable that it should exist. And what I'm going to talk about today is rather sort of more of a general concept of it. Now, a few years ago, I think it was de rigueur to talk about everybody in terms of there being a psychopath. So everybody that one didn't like or disagreed with was suddenly a psychopath. Going back a few more years, it was popular to psychoanalyze everybody in terms of various Freudian foibles which they may or may not have had. The reason why I mention this is that what I'm going to talk about, it doesn't just now mean that everybody that you or one or I disagree with is suddenly a propagandized. Everyone is propagandized to some extent. I mean, if you could consider it being sort of introduced into a culture. There's a certain amount of, if you want to call it, propaganda which goes into that. What we're really talking about is degree, and it's not that now we all go around sort of sticking labels on people. I mean, stick labels on people if you wish to, but it isn't going to change the essential dynamics of the problem. It's just going to mean that you're going to have a new way of explaining the world to yourself, and that's all I'm trying to propose here. Now, of course, there are certain people who are more prone to propaganda than others. And I've lived my life through a process of leftist propaganda. And when I was young, when I was a child, the leftists were the sort of the new kids on the block. They were, as it were, the sort of the government in opposition. And it's very easy to be in opposition because all you have to do is criticize things, and who knows, maybe you're right. But now we see, we've had 50 years, 60 years, 70 years perhaps in total, but, through my life of this leftist propaganda and leftist agenda. And we now see that it doesn't, we see where it goes. It goes to allowing 4 or 5-year-olds to define their gender. It goes to promoting grooming sodomy to children. It goes to destroying Western civilization. It goes to all of these things. Now, I'm not complaining about any of these things exactly. I mean, obviously I don't like them, but I'm not exactly complaining about them because I see a bigger picture. But it's not the bigger picture I want to talk about right now. I want to talk about the characteristics of being propagandized. Now, a common mistake, one I have made many times myself, is to think of the problem as an informational problem, as a logical problem. If only you were able to explain in a sort of clear way how things work to the person who is propagandized, that they would accept this ultimately. But that's not true. And a much better way of understanding it is in terms of alcoholism, compulsive gambling, or religious cult. Intelligence is not the deciding factor here. It's some other quotient, some other thing. And if you want to have a happy life, get your head around this, because you won't do what I have done at some points in my life, which is to try to, as I've mentioned before, try to clear the ocean, empty the ocean with a pitchfork. It's not possible, and more fool you for trying, especially if you keep trying. Now, the reason why I mention all of this is because I came across, this morning, dived into a book called Principles by Ray Dalio. I haven't read it all. I can't opine on its entire contents. I have to say that from what I've read, I mean, I've just dived in to a sort of bit in the middle. When I get a book, I tend to, have a look at its sort of broader context, read the about the author sections, see if they use award-winning, in which case I'll probably avoid it. And I'm just have a sniff of the pages, all of that sort of thing. Have a look at the list of contents, and I'm just reading from somewhere in the middle before I start to decide whether I'm going to read this book or some part of this book or all of this book or whatever it is. Now, my general impressions on the basis of what I've read so far is it has a very materialistic explanation of the different ways that people think. I'm not a materialist ultimately myself. I think it's a fair metaphor. Uses a sort of description of the kind of chemicals that go through. It's the chemical explanation of the human soul, which I find kind of goes to a zero-sum game pretty quickly, and I get quite bored with it, but I can still learn from it. There's another book I read a year or two ago called The Bicameral Mind, the first half of which is all evolutionary materialism and, quite frankly, a little ludicrous. The second half of which is fascinating. So, I try to sort of learn where I can. There are different ways of explaining exactly the same things. For example, from a Quranic point of view, you've got aql, which is like intellect. You've got nafs. You've got ruh, and you've got there are different methods of explaining the human, the layered human condition. If you want to talk about subconscious and unconscious, all the rest of it. Anyway, you have the Hinduistic way of explaining things. I don't find the materialistic way of explaining it or the Freudian way of explaining it particularly convincing, and frankly I would say that it falls into the category, in my mind at least, of propaganda. But leaving all of that to one side, on page 218 I came across a bit that I thought, this is interesting from the point of view of explaining propaganda in its the concept of being propagandized. And I'll just read it to you. It's just a few lines. Quote, "While I had always assumed that logical conversation is the best way for people to get at what is true, armed with this new knowledge about the brain," vis-a-vis what I've just mentioned, "I came to understand that there are large parts of our brains that don't do what is logical. For example, I learned that when people refer to their feelings, such as saying, 'I feel that you are unfair to me,' they are typically referring to messages that originate in the emotional, subconscious parts of their brain." Now, there's another bit I want to read to you. But I just want to say on that, this is what you're really dealing with when you're dealing with highly propagandized people. It's not to do with logic, and propaganda does not deal in logic. If you look at the language of propaganda, and by propaganda I pretty much mean all publicly available or publicly or widely disseminated information, or even entertainment or education or music. It is propaganda in the sense that I use the word. It's a means of forming people's minds. What it's not forming is not really forming. It's not primarily interested in the conscious, logical mind. It's not how it works. What it deals with is to use the sort of Western nomenclature, is the unconscious mind. And what it's doing is that it's kind of hooking in to underlying triggers. Let's see if I can find this other bit. Okay, this is page 221. He's talking about a book by a chap called Charles Duhigg, The Power of Habit. Quote, "Duhigg's core idea is that the role of the three-step, quote, habit loop. The first step is a cue, some, quote, trigger that tells your brain to go into automatic mode and which habit to use, end quote, according to Duhigg. Step two is the routine, quote, which can be physical or mental or emotional, end quote. Let's just note that it isn't intellectual, it isn't rational. To continue. Finally, there is a reward which helps your brain figure out if this particular loop is, quote, worth remembering for the future, end quote. Repetition reinforces this loop over time until it becomes automatic. This anticipation and craving is the key to what animal trainers call operant conditioning, which is a method of training that uses positive reinforcement. For example, dog trainers use a sound, typically a clicker, to reinforce behavior by pairing that sound with a more desirable reward, typically food, until the dog will perform the desired behavior when it merely hears the click. Obviously, you've got the very famous Pavlovian experiments, etc. To continue, in humans, Duhigg says, rewards can be just about anything, ranging from, quote, food or drugs that cause physical sensations to emotional payoffs, such as the feelings of pride that accompany praise or self-congratulation, end quote. Habits put your mind on, quote, automatic pilot, end quote. In neuroscientific terms, the basal ganglia takes over from your cortex so that you can execute activities without even thinking about them. Now, I want to talk about this slightly because what we notice, what we see is that, I'll just give an example. Through the years that I was growing up, Germans and Germany and everything German was evil and bad, you see. Nazism is evil and bad and all of this, and I'm sure it was. But in my view, so was the West. There wasn't an awful lot of daylight between them, but leaving that to one side, we don't care for our purposes about actual objective facts. What we're talking about is perceptions. And all the way through all of my life, the Germans have been basically castigated as the epitome of evil. And obviously Nazism, there was no other evil as bad as that. Apparently, I don't know if that's true. I have no way of verifying it, but that's the narrative. Now, cut to 2022, and suddenly we have people who would have absolutely been prepared, I think to some extent, to die on that hill. They would have, I don't know if they would die on that hill. They'd certainly be prepared to give up a glass of Beaujolais on that hill, on the precept that Nazism is in all cases bad. If you go to 2022, you have exactly the same people, the leftists. And I'm not just against leftists. It's nothing to do with that. But as I mentioned at the beginning, they've had their time in the sun. If you want a good idea of leftism and their psychology, I can't remember which of these two books, since you have to buy both. This one, Technological Slavery by Kaczynski, and this one, The Anti-Tech Revolution, Why and How by Theodore Kaczynski. It's in one of those. I can't remember which. He explains it exceptionally well. So the reason why I mention it is because now these very same people are standing with Ukraine to the last Ukrainian. Actually, they're in favour of what is effectively genocide against the Ukrainian people, which it is. And essentially, Zelensky and his cohorts are selling Ukrainian blood. And that's basically how it works. But my interest isn't in this specifically. It is in the fact that the very same people who stood with, who would have certainly claimed to have been against Nazism in all its manifestations, are now in favour of Nazism. And effectively, they are that because it is largely a Nazi regime. There's no question about that. I'm not here arguing for or against it. I'm, as it were, for or against the proposition. I'm questioning the foundation upon which the proposition stands. And so what we find is that what's happening is that, going back to what Dalio is talking about, or at least quoting, is that there is a payoff here. There's a psychological payoff. And it's step 2 is the routine, which can be physical or mental or emotional. What we see is that the same people who were wearing their masks and clapping for nurses are the same people who are now in favour of standing with Ukraine to the last Ukrainian, effectively backing Nazis. What I'm trying to say is that there is no logical process. This is a habit. It's a habit, and the payoff, repetition reinforces this loop over time until it becomes automatic. And he talks about positive reinforcement. The positive reinforcement is that the media machine itself allows these, what I would argue are weak-minded people, to feel a virtue. That's the payoff for them. Now, there are certain other people who don't care about all of that and stand with principle and a kind of ruthless adherence to at least the principle of truth as they see it, despite the odds. But those people are very few and far between, and you could argue that they suffer from some other sort of malady, some sort of asocial malady, if you want to call it that, etc. What I'm trying to say is that what you're dealing with is not an intellectual or failure of rationality, because rationality's got nothing to do with it. It's to do with the priming and conditioning of the unconscious, subconscious mind to acquire the habit of going along with or enthusiastically embracing whatever the latest thing is. It's very easy, I know I've made this mistake myself, to regard it as an expression of stupidity. They may be stupid too. But stupidity and this characteristic, there is no correlation between them. Just as a stupid man and a highly intelligent man may both be alcoholics or decide to, join the Moonies or whatever it is. Their intelligence or lack thereof is not the primary driver or primary point of interest. It's some other characteristic. And in my view, it's really to do with those who are able to think independently and those who are not. I think that, from what I've seen so far at least, Deleuze's book is interesting insofar as it does, at least in a materialistic way, get to some of the core of it, because much of it's to do with what he calls, in his nomenclature, the reptilian brain. Many people can't really get past this. It's why they can't really think creatively, especially under pressure. It doesn't mean they're stupid necessarily, but they're in the habit, they're in the loop, they're in the reinforcement loop of essentially being weak. And anyway, all that to say that I'm hoping that I can understand more about this mentality, so I can, perhaps make it work better for me as well as for them. But what I'm trying to say is it's a mistake to just go around calling everybody a moron who is highly propagandized. And not everybody, just because somebody disagrees with one, doesn't mean that they're necessarily propagandized. They may well be. So it's not, as I say, going back to these, everyone's a psychopath as was popular 4 or 5 years ago, or going back to the sort of amateur Freudian analyses that people used to, it was a drawing room pastime maybe 20 years ago. Anyway, but that's the basic ballpark of what you're dealing with. Information is the means, but it is not necessarily highly important. What's highly important is conditioning in Hindu philosophy, the vrittis, the chitti, the kind of the subconscious, that mind, the mind thing, putting all of these samskara into that to build up this kind of background impression. There are different systems of nomenclature that you could use to describe exactly the same thing. I do somewhat take issue with his very materialistic definitions and his sort of chemical-driven analyses. But who cares about all of that? You know, the point that he's making certainly here is interesting and applicable. Anyway, I wanted to kind of hit the broader features of why it's not possible to reason with people who are highly propagandized. And today, pretty much everybody is. And if you're not, in a way, you're going to be, I mean, you know, if you're not to the same degree, it's going to, not necessarily an advantage. It's in fact, it brings with it a whole set of new problems. And you know, you really need to be equipped to maintain that without, you know, making some fairly elementary errors yourself. Anyway, that's it. I hope that helps. Details of where I upload to, how you can join my Substack and Telegram channel, support my work and download my books free are in the description. Thanks for listening and bye for now.